Hello.
Hi, Robert.
Hey, how's it going? I
All
got it.
right. How about you?
I'm all right. I had to change the background filter. I had a virtual background.
Okay. All right. Looks good. Looks
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Now it's yeah. But anyway, yeah. So it's already recording once I started. So
Yeah,
I'm just
I
letting
saw
you.
that.
I was just letting you know. Um, yeah. So everybody tuned in to the Real Nordic Black channel. This is Robert Gillen, Rob G. Some people call me. This is if you're tuned in. On this channel, I interview historians, Egyptologists, uh, entertainers, uh, anybody that I find interesting to me. And I ran across the book called The Other Slavery uh, with the distinguished guest that I have right now, Dr. Historian and author, Dr. Andres. I can't say it with a Spanish accent. Andres Reséndez.
You did it beautifully.
Right.
Thank you.
And anyway, I see you have I see you have the setup already. The podcast setup. Uh,
Yes, somebody
full,
sent it to me to record, and I
right.
have to return it. But in the meantime, I'm
Yeah,
using it.
yeah, yeah. I see you got the full setup. But anyway,
Yeah.
so he has a BA from University in National International Relations from Mexico City, correct?
Correct.
Where you grew up.
Right.
PhD, University of Chicago. Um, and he's not new to the Nordic countries because I saw that you were you taught not only at Yale University but also in Helsinki, the University of Helsinki. So that caught my attention a little bit. I didn't realize that until I looked up your biography kind of last minute. Um, yeah, how was that experience there in Helsinki? How long have you lived in Finland?
It was great. It was a Fulbright grant that I got, and
Okay,
I spent that at that year at the University of Helsinki. I
okay,
have to confess that I'm married to a Finnish woman,
okay,
so I
okay.
have extended family in Finland. So I've been going to Finland since
Okay.
and visiting Norway and
Okay.
Sweden
Okay.
since
So this is yeah, yeah. Because I
since
remember.
17. I'm 55, so yes, I do know the region,
Okay,
and
I
I'm very
realized that when we exchanged emails and you said something about the Norwegian time. I was like, I was like, that's cool. He took consideration of the time over here. But and then when I saw that you were you lived in Helsinki or whatnot, I was like, wow, I didn't realize that. So yeah, I'm an African American. Obviously, I've been in Norway for about 9 years now. Um, I'm a dual citizen now. So yeah, and I'm from Oklahoma.
all
So
right.
so that may make a little sense on why I'm also interested in the indigenous cultures, the Native American
I
cultures.
see.
Uh, how I ran into your name was through Roxanne Ortiz.
Yes.
She had endorsed you, posted on Facebook your book and your writings, and so I had to check it out, and I can say I got it on Kindle, and I thumbed through it best I could through a lot of the information, and it's very interesting. I also listened to a few of your interviews about this topic of the other slavery. Um, could we just uh, I would like to ask you what was your reason into what was your what what gave you the reason or motivation into writing this or this research or interest? Uh,
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm a garden variety colonial Mexican historian. So I had previously written about a particular expedition in the 1520s, the Cabeza de Vaca expedition, which basically resulted in, 300 Spaniards and a few African Americans being stranded in Florida when there was no other settlements.
That
And
was your
so,
previous book,
previous
correct?
book,
Right.
exactly. And
And,
so
and
they,
what was the title of that, sir?
it's called A Land So Strange,
Okay.
the epic
That
story of Cabeza de Vaca.
right. I wanted the people to hear that so that they can check it out as well. So
Sure. So it's the one thing leads to another kind of a thing. So in that
absolutely.
story, basically, these expedition goes terribly wrong. Out of the 300, only four end up surviving. Three Spanish officers, and one African American, and they
Mm,
are enslaved for a period of 6 years on the coast, what is now the coast of Texas. And so, in the process of doing that, I became really intrigued by what does it mean to be enslaved by peoples living in the coast of indigenous peoples living in the coast of Texas. And furthermore, they were able to escape their captivity by transforming themselves into medicine men and shamans, so they would cure. And so they became really these precious visitors who were passed from one group to another.
mm,
And in this way, they walked all across, North America, from the coast of Texas all the way to the Pacific side,
okay.
being followed by sometimes thousands of Native Americans from the interior who were hunting for them and carrying water for them, etc. So a
Right.
really crazy story. But at the other end, when these four survivors finally saw other Europeans, what they encountered was a cavalry unit that was in the business of enslaving natives. And of
Right.
course, they became immediately really intrigued by these thousands of followers. They immediately wanted to enslave those followers, and
Now
so
the
they had a
cavalry
showdown.
the cavalry you're talking about is from the Spanish,
The
correct?
Spanish, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
Spanish had been moving from central Mexico to what is now northwestern Mexico and into the American territory at this time, and so they had reached the other side, and that's the people they encountered. So it was like the advancing edge of the Spanish Empire in the
Right.
north.
And
And so
naturally you're interested in it because you were born in Mexico and raised in Mexico City, obviously, as well. That point as well, right?
yeah, so
Yeah, yeah.
I
Like,
was very
yeah.
familiar with the Mexico City side of the
Right.
story. I was less familiar with the
The
northern Mexico
right.
side of the story. But quickly it dawned on me that this was big business. I mean, enslaving Native Americans was very big business. This
Yeah.
was the very edge of Spanish colonialism. And so that's how the idea of writing a book about Indian slavery came to
Came
my
about.
mind. And initially I wanted to do something very self-contained, like 16th century, which is what I had been reading for this previous book. But then over time, I saw how Indian slavery had continued
Mm,
in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. And so I decided that instead of doing a very detailed monographic type of book focused on the 16th century, I wanted to do a broader survey of these phenomenon that I call the other slavery.
mm. And I remember you talked about, like, if one was to Google African slavery, they would find thousands of books about it. And
More than 16,000.
wow.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, the Indian slavery, it's not so much. Right. Uh,
No, although that is changing fast. I
right.
mean, not changing dramatically, but
Right.
from a couple of dozen books that we had, now there's a lot coming online because of
Right.
the renewed interest on this subject.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, there was one book in particular that I haven't read yet, but it was an African American girl. And I can't think of the name right now. But anyhow, I was gonna ask you about that later, but I what was life like in the colonial Americas, or colonial Mexico and Southwest America, pretty much at the time where you did majority of your research, and also the Caribbean that you,
Sure.
so that's part of the Americas too, in general.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I want to be very, I mean, we could spend a whole hour
Yeah, that,
talking
yeah, yeah.
about
No,
that,
I
but
that's why I
but I
said that's
will
why I said in general. If you can,
very,
yeah,
very. So the Caribbean was the first home of the Spanish in the New World,
right,
and it was also probably the worst slaving ground at the time. So basically, the Caribbean was ideal for slaving because you had indigenous populations constrained to small islands, and some were large islands, but it was the kind of thing that you could come with a boat with some horses and dogs, and you could round up people. You can build a holding pen in the beach, and then round everybody up, and then load them up into the vessels and take them. The Caribbean was
Correct.
such a bad thing because Spaniards discovered gold in some of the large islands, especially the Spanish island Española, which is the island shared today by Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Right.
And so they needed people to work on in those gold fields. So that's how that happened. But later on in just moving on to your question, the backbone of the colonial economy in the continent was silver rather than gold.
I remember
And
you pointed out that fact a lot, and especially in Mexico, that you've uh, pinpointed that there were so many. I don't know how many mines, but so many silver mines there, and that was a huge factor. In fact, you said it accounted for about almost about half, if not over half, of silver production around those times, or around a certain period of
yeah,
time.
right, in the second half of the 18th century.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
Mm,
Yeah, so it was a huge business, and getting the silver out of the ground was really
tough
labor
work.
intensive work.
Right.
so
But
yeah.
and with that being said, I remember you talking about the contrast between African slavery and Indian slavery.
Mhm.
Um, can and well, I have a point to make as well because of the silver production. Uh, well, I'll let you continue. Uh,
No, no,
what
go
do you
ahead.
have?
Ask.
No, about no, because you had mentioned about the contrast between those two. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that? Uh,
Sure. So, broadly speaking, first of all, I will say that uh, Indian slavery has taken a lot more time for us to understand in its complete scope because there were fewer records than about African slavery. African slavery was legal
yeah,
from the very beginning,
yeah,
and an Indian slavery was very early on outlawed, and yet it happened on the ground. So there are fewer records. Second of all, African slaves had to cross an entire ocean. And so
yeah,
they were counted along the way. There are port records associated with them. So it is easier to locate them in the archives of the world. Whereas for Indian slavery, they were both procured and consumed locally or regionally, and so that we have no port records. And because it was illegal, people seldom talked about it. So, having said that, we have a very continuous paper trail about raids, about people being held against their will
yeah,
in many places. So we do have that contrast. There's also an interesting contrast in terms of who was targeted. So African slavery targeted a majority of adult males
right,
because it was meant for a plantation economy type of thing. Um, Indian slavery, it varied. So, for example, in these silver mines that we're talking about, there were lots of males being employed, although
that's
they also employed
that's what
women.
that's what I was getting at. You knew it.
Yeah, women and children.
Right, right.
But
No, because of the
in
mind,
many,
because like you said, now because I heard you say that, and then but now you said that it varied because I think you knew what I was getting at. Because the silver mines, they would require, especially a lot of men to work those mines, and so
Mhm.
I was that's why I was questioning how could that be about the so many women and children at that point in time. But I think you meant later on.
No,
Correct, correct,
I mean, the mines also required women and children. Children were
correct.
really good because they could crawl into very small places
Okay,
to get the ore.
okay,
And
okay.
women labor were also required. But in addition to the mines, there were also many Native American women who were brought into the domestic service. And
Right,
so owners viewed domestic service as more appropriate for women rather than men.
right, right. No, how about the you talked about the language. No, I remember I wrote a quote that you had said. You said it's seductive to think that the arrival of Europeans changed everything uh suddenly. meaning that they already had slavery going on before the Europeans arrived. Could you elaborate just a little bit on that part?
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So again, whenever one talks about slavery, there's
Right,
always this certain tension about, okay, who did it, who is guilty, and who is the victim, et cetera, et
right,
cetera. But in the case of Indian slavery, the reality is that it's more about the human nature. So everybody who was in a position to benefit from this did it.
I
And
agree. Yeah,
so what we find is that it was going on prior to contact, as far back as we can see in the archaeological and documentary record. We see pre-contact Native Americans engaged in captivity and slaving practices that were not all that different. People make the argument that they were super different. And yes, it is true that they were embedded in specific cultural contexts, but they
mm,
were close enough to what Europeans understood as slavery
yeah,
that it was very easy to fold these practices into European forms of enslavement. So it existed before, it continued after the Europeans. All European powers did it, the English, the French, the
right.
Portuguese, the Dutch,
Dutch, yeah,
um, as well as the Spanish, of
Norwegian,
course.
Danish, as well. Yeah,
And Native Americans,
mm,
after contact, did it.
yeah,
There were a few who did not do it, but it was mostly out of environmental reasons, right?
right.
So, for example, in that story that I was telling you about the captivity of the four
Yeah,
survivors of the
right.
Cahusac expedition, uh, there were moments in the story in which the four survivors needed to make contact with people because otherwise they would have died of exposure or starvation or whatever.
Wow.
And so they
Yeah.
offer themselves as slaves to
Mm,
whoever was around in order to survive.
right.
And oftentimes they were either rejected as slaves, which is rather remarkable, or they were kind of tolerated as kind of like stray dogs in the camp. So it
Right.
was a very different type of slavery that we think, and that's because it may be in some circumstances useful to have slaves, but they were also additional mouths to feed, and
Right.
so
Understandable.
the calculation was not necessarily there.
Right. Now, you also got into the language part on uh, how it got consumed between what would you say the year of 1521. I heard you mention that in the fall of Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, the
Hmm.
historic center of Mexico City. From the time that Mexico City fell, how long did it take for the indigenous people to incorporate or amalgamate the Spanish language into to their language? Like far as Mexico, I
Oh,
went back into Mexico. I'm going back and forth from Southwest in
yeah, yeah,
Mexico.
yeah. No, that's
Yeah,
good. Well, yeah, that's an interesting question because it took a lot longer than people imagine.
yeah,
There's a scholar named James Lockhart who actually did a close study of the documents that survived. So of course, the people who lived in Mexico before the arrival of the Spanish were mostly speakers of the Nahuatl language, and that was
yeah.
a huge. It remains, like a huge linguistic group in Mexico. But at first, they completely overwhelmed the few Spaniards that were in Mexico City. So they, even though they learned our alphabet, and they continue to write in Nahuatl. So
Okay,
there are many documents in the archival record with these. And so he was able to see how, at first, the influence of Spanish was so minimal that they had to resort to uh, complicated discussion. For example, they didn't have a word for horse. There were no horses in the Americas at the time of the arrival of Europeans.
right, right.
So they had to they describe horses in these documents as big deer that
Okay,
can be mounted by Europe by people, or
got you.
this kind of thing, which
Right,
already suggests that the influence was minimal. Eventually, and that took decades before they started actually incorporating words
words.
like
Right.
like horse or whatever,
Right.
knives, pants, shirts, all of these things that were new, that there were no words for. And eventually, in the fullness of time, after centuries, they started the impact of Spanish was so overwhelming that it actually affected the syntax, the way in which the sentences were constructed in Nahuatl, so that they kind of adopted a Spanish type syntax.
Okay.
So anyways, it was a very
So of
gradual
course
process.
the grammar came later. Correct. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the last stage of the influence of Spanish.
Okay. So
Yeah.
when would you
So it
say
took.
when would you say Spanish was pretty much ingrained in South America or the Americas, excuse me, in Mexico in the 1560s or 70s?
Well, as I said, it was a it was a gradual process.
Gradual
I don't
process.
think
Right,
there's
right.
no date that I can give you that from
Okay.
here on, because it kept happening all the
Right,
time, and it
right,
remained incomplete even 300 years after, when these nations became independent from
right,
Spain in the
right.
early
True.
19th century. Yeah,
No, and that was your point that you were talking about. It was no sudden sudden takeover or of everything. It was a slow, gradual process on that.
exactly.
Now
Yeah,
you posit that uh, not just smallpox uh, took over the indigenous population in the Caribbean, especially in Mexico, I believe. I think mainly you were talking about the Caribbean. But you were
yeah.
saying it was more in line with the labor or slavery. Could you kind of elaborate on what you meant by that? That it wasn't just the smallpox or the epidemics, as you talk about this synergetic relationship that you talk about a
Sure,
lot between slavery and epidemics.
sure.
Could you get that?
Yeah. So the first thing is that if you look at the records in the 16th century, a few records really talk about illness, but most of the records really talk about military engagements, violence, exploitation. They talk about the appropriation of indigenous women, hunger. A lot of them really deal with hunger. So clearly, our image that we have formed, especially since the 1960s, when these school of academics from Berkeley, Woodrow Bora, Cook, etc., kind of took seriously the question of what could be the initial population of the Americas, and they came up with really high numbers.
Right.
They were called the high counters. And so, if you have very high numbers, and then you have towards the middle or the late 16th century censuses that are much lower, then the question begins: how can it be possible that just a few thousand Europeans could have inflicted such enormous losses? And so the only explanation could have been that there was these catastrophic um,
Epidemics.
epidemics
Right.
that wiped out a long population. But
But can't you get some of that information through some of the early chroniclers or in journals from people that didn't they talk about these epidemics of
they did, yeah, they did,
right,
but there was a lag. So, for example, the example that I want to talk is, let's understand first of all that the worst killer by far was smallpox, for example, and smallpox, it was an endemic illness in Europe in the 16th century, meaning that you got it when you were a child and you either died or you survived and became lifelong immune and you were unable to pass it on to others.
right.
So if you think about these ships going from Europe to the Americas in the 16th century, chances were low that an ill person would be aboard one of those ships, because most of them were adults, and they had already suffered this when they were young and they no longer were infectious. So, number one. Number two, the sailing voyage from southern Spain to the Caribbean would be anywhere between 4, 5, 6 weeks, around that framework. And that is long enough for anybody who was infected, who got aboard in Spain, it usually takes about 2 weeks for that to manifest itself. So they would have died along the way. Their corpse would have been dumped into the water.
Mm,
And so, really, there are only two possible ways in which smallpox could have made it across. And one was to have two people, an infected person and a susceptible subject on the same boat, or perhaps having scabs where the virus can, smallpox is a pretty horrific in which
Right.
you get all kinds of
We
anyways.
seen we
So
seen the Mel Gibson movie.
exactly. So some of those scabs would have remained in some bedding or something like that, and somehow that would have made it to the New World.
Right.
So the fact is, we don't have, as yours in regards to your question,
Mm,
we don't have any definite mention of smallpox until 1518. So that is 26 years after Columbus. So this mental image that we have of, oh, the
mm,
Europeans just arrived and spread these pathogens is just not there. Of course, it is impossible to rule out the possibility of
right.
unreported epidemics. But the evidence that we have suggests that it took a while before epidemics made it across the Atlantic, just because it was such a long voyage and because
Right.
of the um, but before that, even during those 26 years, if you look at the population of Hispaniola, you can see that it dwindled from whatever the initial population, and there are different estimates, to about a tenth, or maybe 5%, or maybe 2% of what it had been at the time of contact.
Right.
So you can see that stuff other than epidemics was clearly at work. And epidemics arrived, and yes, it wreaked havoc, but it was a later arrival that basically came to give the coup de grace.
And you conclude that it, like you said, famine, um, the hardship of the mines, the gold mines at the time, and slavery, all together. Yeah.
I,
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to go back to what you pointed out, and I completely forgot, which is the synergy between mortality and epidemics, or epidemics and slavery. Um, so basically, what I saw, for example, is that in the aftermath of this first very devastating smallpox epidemic that occurred in 1518, and everybody, there are multiple records about that. It's very clear. Uh, the At the time, it was kind of legal. It was semi-legal to do slaving in the Caribbean, and before you could go out on a slaving expedition, you had to get a license from the crown. And so you can look at these licenses, and you can see that the number of those licenses were low, kind of low in the 1515, 16, 17, 18, and then they spiked in 18 and 19, the years 15, 18, and 19, just as this. And so you can imagine what's happening. Basically, these people exploiting the mines had many of their workforce die in this epidemic, and all of a
Right.
sudden they needed to replace the dead population.
Right.
And so they immediately requested permits to go out to the other islands and get some more people to be brought back to the mines. And so you can see that from the Native Americans' perspectives. They are grappling with a completely unknown, previously unknown illness.
Right.
Many of them died. Some of them survived, and the survivors all of a sudden see these ships coming to take them to the silver mine. So in this case, the gold mines of Española. So you can see how the two operated together in very
Absolutely.
insidious ways. Yeah,
Right. Now, can we get on Columbus a little bit?
sure.
Because I know he plays a major role in the Caribbean. Um, and speaking of the Caribbean in itself, it's kind of peculiar compared to all the other, kind of the slavery that's done on the continents. But you said that he at one point kind of opposed indigenous slavery. That he even did you mention that or something? Well,
No,
no, no, no. You
no,
mentioned that he talked in contrast to African slavery. He wanted. You said something about um, uh, Columbus wanting the stop
sure.
of indigenous slavery, correct?
No,
And wanted.
no. Columbus, before coming to the Americas, or
Okay.
going in your case
Right.
to the Americas, he traveled to Africa.
Right.
in the company of Portugal. I mean, he lived in Portugal for a decade before moving to Spain.
Okay.
And so he was able to go to the coast of Ghana, what is now the coast of Ghana,
Right.
where he saw how the Portuguese were actually making a financially advantageous businesses by dealing in humans. And so even before he came to the Americas, he had a model of how
Okay.
far off distant colonies could be profitably exploited, even in the absence of other marketable commodities like gold or silver.
So that was
And
before
so,
the New World. Okay.
yeah, this
I
is in the
thought you were
1480s.
okay. I thought you were saying that, you know, that at, I don't know, in the during that time, in the start of the raids in the Caribbean or whatever, that Columbus, at some point after seeing a whole bunch of them die off, or for whatever reasons, that he tried to, I don't know, write to the crown or something. I don't know why I thought that. Um, that
No, no, no. He actually wrote to the crown
okay.
endorsing the full, because that's how he, because he visited the Portuguese, slaving port.
Right.
That was the model he had in mind later on in 1492 when he
Right.
went to the Americas, and later
Right.
on he made four voyages. Um, so he had that model in mind, and he right. I mean, there are letters preserved by him telling to the Spanish monarchs that, hey, we can send as many as you want from these guys, and they are so
Me,
much better
me,
slaves than the
meaning.
Africans.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
Columbus, yeah,
yeah, yeah, but
Colum,
that's yeah, yeah, Columbus, and that's kind of what I meant. And one, at one point, I didn't know if he was that was kind of before they start to discover the New World. But no, I was no, because I find it kind of ironic that he was talking about, 'cause, the New World, that the African would be, or the Indian slaves would be, uh, worth more in strength and ingenuity, as you said, or whatever. And
yeah,
then you have him coming over there, and then all of them dying off, and then they have to come to those Africans to get them to use their strength and ingenuity
yeah,
to continue the
yeah.
job.
That's
Yeah.
because Columbus, like
So
all
that was my
Europeans,
point.
no, it was good. It's a good point. Columbus, along with other Europeans, subscribed to that I think your listeners in Norway would find interesting.
Yeah.
Subscribe to uh, a model of the world in which the climate shaped the character of the people.
Yeah.
And so the people who lived in the far north of
Uh,
Europe, according to Columbus, were um, feisty and warlike, but
right.
lacked intelligence.
Right.
And the people who lived in the hot regions of the world, so by that he meant the equator,
Yeah.
they were intelligent and ingenious but lacked courage.
Right.
And uh, and
That
so
in antiquity, and then that was
in antiquity, oh
how
yeah,
they
this,
saw racism in antiquity.
oh yeah, this,
Have you heard of
yeah,
Professor Benjamin Isaac?
no,
No, he's written a real big book on. Matter of fact, I have it somewhere. A real thick book on that subject, and a lot of people draw from him, who I'm going to
yeah,
interview, who I'm supposed to interview next week about this. But
oh great,
and
great,
he gets right into that topic, but mainly not so much slavery, but racism. But
yeah,
I was gonna add some notes to that. See, the thing is, I kind of got excited because I know what I want to really ask you and all this, but I'm forgetting that I have the people that haven't read your work or that don't know anything about you. So I have to let you get, some of the groundwork, to
sure, yeah,
um
totally,
but the the many different Indian tribes and nations partook in slavery, correct? You said that it
correct,
pretty much eventually kind of engulfed the U.S.
right,
And you said especially the Comanche Nation, and being from Oklahoma, where they have a bunch of Comanche tribes. That's all you see in Kiowa, Apache,
hmm,
Fort Sill, Apache. Well,
oh yeah,
I was born in Fort Sill. Um,
wow,
yeah, yeah, and in other, I think Delaware, and uh, there's another one. I was just naming that. There's seven primary ones I know there. But anyway, definitely Kiowa and Comanche. And you had mentioned that the Comanche tribe had much to do with the slavery, or majority of it, or dominated it, as you say.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah, right, right. Well, this is something that happened all over the Americas. I mean, not
Right.
just in the United States. Meaning, as Native Americans transformed themselves into equestrian, acquired horses from the Europeans and acquired firearms, became some of them became pretty important players and made their homelands into great trading centers. And the Comanche is the greatest example in this region.
Right.
But again, the Navajos did it, the Apaches did it, so the Utes did it too. Um, but the Comanches, by virtue of their power, were able to trade both in horses as well as in slaves and many other
They
commodities.
were
So
like
they would,
they were like the Dahomies of Africa in Africa,
yeah.
right?
So they actually
Yeah.
supplied indigenous slaves to other groups, as
Right.
to other indigenous groups, as well as to Spaniards in New Mexico and the French in along the New Orleans River. I mean the New Orleans, and then farther north to the English. So they became quite adept at adapting to the system and exploiting the system.
Mm. And they were masters of the horseback riding culture and
They
stuff like that. You said.
They
Yeah.
did. So there are some really good works by a couple of scholars, especially Pekka Hamalainen, who is a Finnish scholar who is now at Oxford, and Brian
Okay.
DeLay, an American who is at Berkeley, both of whom detail some of these incredible raids that launched from the Comancheria, as it was called, the Spanish called it, the homeland of the Comanches, deep into Mexico to get captives and then brought them back into Comancherias. And Comanches, both resold some of these captives
Right.
for a profit, of course, but they also kept many of them. So many of these slaves were incorporated into their own tasks, into their own way of life. For example, many women were incorporated as secondary wives who partook of the labors, especially the buffalo
And
processing the meat and the curing the hides, etc., or the children who were often set aside to look after the horses and the mares.
right. And then I heard at their peak they were about what, 40,000 or whatnot.
Yeah, something like that. That sounds about right.
And then
Yeah,
they didn't really have like a centralization. It was more like a bunch of
different bands,
bands and
exactly.
stuff like that. Okay.
Yeah, yep.
Um, they were. I heard they were once part of the Shoshone tribe, or Shoshone. Have you heard of that? Yeah.
Yeah, so they came from the north, and they
Right. Originally,
were
yeah.
yeah, they kind of migrated from the north, and they
Broke away
eventually
or whatnot.
yeah arrived into what is now northern New Mexico, and eventually they kind of moved into what is now the eastern. So their homeland became wedged between what is now Texas and New Mexico in that big region.
Right.
And they basically, which had been previously occupied by Apache bands, and they basically pushed the Apache bands further south into Mexico,
I,
and came to
from
occupy
from
these
what I've
regions.
been reading, or whatever, the Comanches, they had to like not only suppress the Spanish and Mexicans in the South, they had to fight other tribes and stuff, and also the the settling of the Americans on the East. So they had a lot of things going on, pretty much
Oh
kind of at
yeah,
the same time or whatnot.
oh yeah,
So
that's
it's
right.
like amazing.
Can I just say that I'm gonna have to go at 10,
Okay.
we still have plenty of time, but I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wanted
No,
to
right on
let
the
you know. Yeah,
no, yeah, right
yeah,
on that. No, how
yeah,
about the Trail of Tears? Because a lot of people have been talking about that they were also African American, well, yeah, African American slaves that went along during the Trail of Tears. That's kind of least talked about subject in a
yeah.
way. Have you
Well,
kind of
this is a subject I don't go into, but the two slaveries, so African slavery and the other slavery, or Native American slavery or Indian slavery,
right?
um, coexisted. So you have groups like Cherokees who owned African slaves, and vice versa, although probably less frequently.
Mm,
Um, and in fact, I have found places where you find all of these slaveries working side by side. So in some of these silver mines that I was talking to you about in northern Mexico, within the same shaft, the same pit, you would find African slaves, some of them brought all the way directly from Africa. You would find Indian slaves captured and sold for 50 pesos or 100 pesos a piece, also working in the same, rubbing shoulders with the African slaves. And you would also have freed Native Americans who arrived willingly, and they would get paid in kind. So they would get the ability to, they would get some time in the day in which they could procure silver ore for themselves
mm,
after they had completed their shift, and that's the way they were paid. And but they were not bound to the mine, so to speak. So you had all of these different laboring populations brushing shoulders with each other and coexisting in the same place. So it is kind of an interesting phenomenon. And the same thing goes. I mean, we were talking about the Comanches and Utes and Apaches. I
right.
mean, one of the things that is the most difficult to understand, at least to me, is that all of these groups were both victims of enslavement. They occasionally suffered raids from others, and their members were enslaved. But at the same time, they partook in this in this business as well.
As well,
So they
correct.
were both. They did both.
Right. As well as certain African groups as well at certain periods of
Oh
times,
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
sure.
No, in
Yeah, yeah.
Africa it
So,
was the same thing.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Um, correct. Now, but you talked about your four, what do you say, your four characteristics of slavery
Sure.
that you considered? Yeah.
Sure, I can say very briefly. So one of the questions was if, because I did a full counting, try to estimate the number of, so because it's useful to just begin to, what are we really talking about in terms of numbers? So there were 12.5 million
Mm,
Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. So how many indigenous, and there were very Indian slaves existed. And so I counted anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million
I saw that.
between
Hmm.
Columbus and 1900. So not quite as many, but a very significant
Yeah,
number. And in
absolutely.
some regions, even a greater percentage than African slavery. So a very significant one. But in order to do that, I needed to define exactly what do I mean, who counts as a slave. And so and it was a murky thing because, as we said, African Indian slavery was legal for a while, but then it became illegal.
Mm.
And so the owners resorted to all kinds of subterfuges in order to get around the
And
law.
and how early did you say it was 1550 or
42,
45? 42,
42,
excuse me.
42.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
in
it's
law, but yeah, not in practice,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah. Well, yeah, and so that law had some, contrary to what we may believe, had some important repercussions. So, for example, up until then, thousands of Native Americans had been shipped across the Atlantic to Europe.
Right.
And that traffic pretty much ceased after the passage of the new laws. They were called the New Laws of 1542. So that kind of stopped. But in the New World, where coerced Indian labor was absolutely fundamental for the economy, that could not happen. And so people no longer kept quote unquote slaves. They kept people in deposit, or they resorted to all kinds of subterfuges and euphemisms. So I mean, we could spend the rest of the time. But anyways, the point is,
Yeah.
so I needed to come up with some way of defining what do I mean, regardless of what the Spaniards called what they were doing. Who counts as a slave for me? And I found these four things that you're alluding to. So first, um, normally they had to be forcibly transported from one place to another. And the reason for that is that you could not really exploit or capture somebody from a neighboring group, because if you were the beneficiary of that, that person could either flee there or their relatives may attack you.
Makes
So it
sense.
had to be transported a longer distance in order for
Mm,
this system to work. So number one, they were forcibly transported, not always, but the overwhelming majority of the times. Second of all, once this person was in the work site, this person was unable to leave.
right.
I mean, that's key. Regardless of what you call
Absolutely.
it, that
Captive.
was
Yeah,
what happened. Yeah. And number three, violence, or at least the threat of violence, was used in order to make you work.
yeah.
Number
Right.
three, and number four, the payment that you received was either zero or a token payment. It was
Mm,
symbolic, well below the market rates. And the reason I say that is because sometimes when you are too strict about the definitions, so for example, some scholars told me, well, but they got paid. So there's an institution called repartimiento. So Native Americans were forcibly transported from the town. They were for a period of weeks or months or whatever, and they were paid something. But the payment was so symbolic, so ridiculously below, and so obviously not. So the people themselves were not willing to work at this rate, that the payment is irrelevant. It is
right.
they are being forced to work,
Yeah,
even
I
though
agree.
they do receive some payment.
Right.
So those are the
Right.
four
I
characteristics that
agree with that. Some people have that strict sense of if they get any money, oh, they're not slave or whatnot. But then, and on the flip side of the coin, sometimes if the term is so broad and when we go into modern day slavery, which I heard you talk about human, from human trafficking, you got slavery consists of all kinds of stuff. It's not only sexual slavery, you also
yeah,
have prison labor,
sweatshops, yeah, prison
sweatshop,
labor,
prison labor.
yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
if you heard of the book with Michelle Alexander, the new
yeah,
Jim Crow.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, you got from Zimbabwe, the diamond mines. You got from Libya after they were taken over, and all these other peoples or whatever. So in essence, and then from children, which they say count is up to what 40% of, or something like that, 40% of slaves in modern day slavery. So in that sense, I mean, you have a countless amount of, I mean, you can essentially, like when you talked about the Indian slavery continued on, somebody can possibly make the argument about the African slavery too, because up until, what was it, 2014, if I'm mistaken, I may no, 2019 or 2018, where I'm getting at Clotilda, the slave ship. And the reason why it means something to me, because my father was born in Mobile, Alabama, and so
okay.
that's a connect. I have a connection on all sides of this whole coin. You
I
see,
see.
so
Yeah,
that's
I
why,
can see.
as you
I'm
see, from
realizing.
from
Yeah,
from from Oklahoma, I was born in Fort Sill. Uh, One of my points to Clotilda. Actually, my grandfather's from Georgetown, Guyana. So he's from Guyana. My father's from
wow,
Guyana.
wow.
But my father was born. My grandfather worked at the port in Mobile. Anyway, so my father was born in Mobile, Alabama, where Africa Town, Cujo, one of the last survivors. Um, and so, as you see, even in African slavery, it continued a long time and
Yeah,
practice.
well,
And I mean, to this very day, not just African slavery, but to this day, slavery is being practiced. You know,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, one of the points that I try to make is that in some ways this type of slavery, in which it is forbidden all over the world, or it was forbidden by the Spanish crown early on and by others later on, but it happens on the ground and using prison sentences or debts or whatever it is the most typical type of slavery. Chattel slavery, in the way we
That was so,
understand it as
right, right,
classic, that is the outlier, sort of the historical outlier, because that is not what we are seeing today mostly. And
right.
so
Well, I think
just
when
to
they
just
say when
to
they
finish,
say chattel slavery, I think for the people listening, I think they mainly mean where it passes on where that you're somebody's property, and then also it can pass on to somebody, to your descendants, and all these things. Like it just,
Exactly.
yeah,
But yeah, and also that it is a type of slavery that it is sanctioned by
right,
nations and empires around the world. It is legal, and everybody knows about it. There's no
correct,
hiding it.
right,
That is extraordinary in the I mean, the most typical is when it is forbidden but it happens on the ground, which is what we are seeing in these modern forms of enslavement that you were talking about. That's exactly what it is.
right.
And the most direct forerunners are the kinds of things, the other slavery that I'm describing. And I just wanted to close by saying that you are totally right
Mm,
about the fact that um, even though the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation may have
right,
ended
right,
African slavery in the United States, these other mechanisms immediately kicked in. And so, for example, the U.S. Congress in 1867 passed the Peonage Act.
right.
So, peonage being a holding of somebody against his or her will until the liquidation of a debt, which was the preeminent way in which the other slavery expressed itself in the West. And so the Congress passed an act in 1867 to end that in New Mexico, which they thought was the main offender where this happened. But many of the cases prosecuted were actually in the South. So clearly that technology was immediately applied to the South. And so in places like Alabama and Mississippi, you have some of the Peonage Acts, some of the cases of the Peonage Act. It was very seldom used in New Mexico, where peonage continued, by the
Mm,
way,
mm,
well
mm,
into the 20th century.
mm.
Um, but just to show the continuities, both in the case of the former African American slaves,
Right.
as well as the former Native American slaves.
And I see we have 10 minutes. So,
Yep,
right?
yep,
Okay. Now,
sure.
but so much so that the Clotilda, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a famous person that, on Jimmy Fallon show, The Roots, the
Uh-huh.
band, the guy
Yeah.
Questlove, the drummer,
Uh-huh.
he's actually
Right.
related. He's actually related to one of the slaves that was on the Clotilda. His great great
Wow.
great grand father and mother, I believe, both. So that's how relevant it is.
Yeah,
Um,
I didn't
yeah,
know that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then also, man, I almost lost my point, so I'm trying to rush it in there. Because lastly, in a short, I want you to talk about your new book, and just very short with that. But
Very.
before that, uh, damn it. Oh, no, when we talked about slavery, um, in the book, and in a lot of talks I hear you talk about slavery and stuff like that, but and I always say, of course there was slavery, yeah, from the Roman empires to the Ottomans, and in Africa. In one sense, somebody can say the Africans never stopped suffering slavery. I mean, Herodotus wrote about it, Strabo
Hmm.
wrote about it.
Hmm.
um you know from as early written records from the 5th century BC.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
and then also during the 7th century, the eastern markets all the way to the Middle East, the Indian Ocean. So
Yeah.
in one sense you can say that Africa has never, almost never, if you want to, in my estimation, in my opinion, and all the way to modern slavery, it never it never stopped.
Yeah.
And then at the end, and when you look back in classical terms, during the 5th century, they were talking about Africans as far as Ethiopians or whatnot, as far as
Yeah.
Herodotus. And then you think, was it where in the 5th century BC, who was in the Americas at that time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we have a very myopic view. I mean, we think of Western Africa slavery and transatlantic slavery. This is what people know about,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but they
No, I
forget
I got a broad, definitely.
the
Yeah,
whole Eastern, the flow of African slaves flowing to the East
right. It's a
is kind
different
of
subject.
eclipsed, and it was a pretty significant trade. I
Absolutely.
mean,
Lasted
traffic.
longer. Lasted longer than transatlantic, actually.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
And of course we forget also in Southeast Asia. I mean, forms of
yeah.
enslavement, in Asia as well. So it's not something that happened in just one place and it's one
Right, right,
story
right,
with a
right,
clear
right,
beginning and a clear end. It's actually a very messy story affecting the entire world. We're talking about human nature,
right, right,
people
right,
benefiting from this system.
right,
Yeah.
right. No, I always try to tend to look, and try to see if I can see certain leanings or biases in certain texts of where certain origins where people come from. Like I got some questions definitely to ask the next person. Next week I talked about it. Talks about racism. He's Jewish. He's really a citizen, for example. And I
Yeah.
noticed certain things in his text or whatever that I would definitely can't wait to ask him to. But anyway, it was nice having you. I know it was real short and it just crammed up everything, but could you say the last words about any work that your new book that's coming out in what, November
It's in
or
September. Yeah, it's coming
September?
in
Excuse me.
September. Yeah,
Correct. And
sure. Very, very briefly, it's a book. Whereas this other slavery was huge, a large area and multiple centuries. This is just one expedition. It's an obscure but nonetheless crucial expedition of the world that happened in
mm,
1564, 65. Nobody knows about it, but it was the first expedition that went from the
1465, 15.
1564
Got 15.
to
Okay,
1565.
got you.
The first expedition that went from the Americas to Asia and back. So that is the expedition that opened up the Pacific, a much larger ocean than the Atlantic, and made it a vital space of contact and exchange. And what's interesting is that the Columbus of the Pacific, so to speak, was not a white European, even though white Europeans were the overwhelming majority of the, ship owners and officers, etc. But it was a remarkable Afro-Portuguese pilot
Mm,
who was coming from southern Portugal, which was the preeminent sailing region in the world at the time, and he rose through the ranks until becoming a pilot, which was the highest occupation he could aspire to. And then he did it. I mean, he mastered the technology. He was able to. He was the first to go, as I said, um, and uh, and yet because of his race and because of the circumstances, he was condemned to die by hanging by the Spanish crown in repayment for
mm,
his services. And the glory went to another, no less remarkable individual, a friar mariner. So that's kind of that story that I tried to tell in this
okay,
book, a completely different book from this one.
got you. And lastly, is there anything else that you can talk about that you're working on?
Sure. I mean, more recently, I am following up on that first. If that first expedition opened up the Pacific, then
Oh,
the follow
you
up
just keep
is,
on building. Follow. Yeah, I like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's the germs and the plants and the animal exchanges that occurred across the Pacific, the so-called Magellan Exchange, as I call it, that really transformed the world in ways that we have not fully appreciated. So that's the book that I'm writing now.
last question. Do you believe that there's like a pressure for authors, best-selling authors as yourself, to come up with ways to, let's say, like to come up with the sort of fringe theory or something different, so much so that uh, when they produce new work that they have to, certain writers, I'm not saying you, but I'm saying certain authors or certain uh, writers have to, so much so, are trying to find new and different things, so much so that they kind of end up not properly having, have sufficient evidence to
Well, I
substantiate
mean,
most of their, because I
you have to
noticed.
make a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm rushing because I need to
Okay.
go now.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
uh,
All right,
but I
all right.
just wanted to say that look, I'm a history professor, so I don't need to. I mean, I
No, I
do.
know you.
It would
I'm
be
not.
nice to
Yeah, yeah.
write books, but I don't have to. So I write books whenever I get enough information and I feel
Right.
that there's a good story that people will be interested in.
So
Otherwise, I could be
yeah.
writing articles and other and
So you haven't
academic
noticed
articles.
other writers that, yeah,
I mean, I'm
or
sure
your
there are
opinion,
all kinds of pressures.
Yeah, yeah.
If you depend on money from the selling of your books, then you
All right,
probably
all right,
face a very different landscape, kind of a thing.
all right. All right, guys. He has to go,
Thank you
and
so much.
right, definitely. All right. Thank
Thank
you,
you so much
doctor.
for everything, Robert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.
Yeah. Let me see.